Sisters and brothers, we gather today with this very challenging reading for us in the context of Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel, which in these last weeks has said so much to us about mercy. If we fail, how many chances we get to be made whole. Or as we heard last week, if our debt of $1 billion is forgiven, how much more we should be able to forgive others for their small debts. Today's reading comes to us, and we might begin to reflect through the lens of Matthew himself. Matthew, the author of this gospel. Matthew, the tax collector. Matthew, the one who had compromised with the Romans. Matthew, the one who, by any standard in the Jewish community, would have been seen as one of the least worthy of God's love and mercy. St. Bede, in reflecting on the gospel call of Matthew, used these words to say how Jesus called Matthew. And he's reflecting on what's actually written in the text. And it's heard a couple of different ways. Having mercy by choosing him. Having mercy by choosing him. That means he didn't choose Matthew because he was going to be forgiven. He chose Matthew because he knew he was a sinner. He chose Matthew because he knew he was a sinner. God's love and abundant mercy is so great. So, in a story of two lives, Matthew, we hear his call. Pope Francis, at the age of 17, went to confession on the feast of St. Matthew. And in his sacrament of reconciliation, he experienced the moving call of Christ, who, seeing him as a sinner, still chose him. And so Pope Francis's motto that he's had since he was ordained a bishop is exactly that, having mercy by choosing him. Through the eyes of mercy, he was chosen to be priest, then bishop, and now Holy Father of the Church. This reading today is a further explanation of that mercy that God has for us. Sisters and brothers, it's not meant for anyone right now except for each of us sitting here to hear, Riley, how God loves you beyond all measure and always will. Each of us, in the midst of whatever we're suffering, whatever we're dealing with, whatever we're confronting, that God in his love and mercy is there for us. So often, in our Christian educations, in our formation, we find ourselves trying to live up, to be able to pray enough, to fast enough, to alms give enough that we merit God's mercy. The reminder of this reading today, sisters and brothers, is no matter how late you come to the game, no matter how late. So the story's told of two people. We'll call one Mary, we'll call one John, just because that's easy. Mary lived her whole life, a very pious woman, holy, devout, praying her rosary, going to Mass, weekly adoration, welcoming the poor into her home, feeding those who are hungry. She did everything right her entire life. Everything right. People said of her, when you think of the holy people in our parish, look to Mary. The other was John. John, convicted of rape, 2 murders, in prison. John and Mary die in the same day, same hour. John's murdered by another prisoner. Mary simply passes away at the end of an old, long, well-lived life. Both appear before the seat of Christ. Christ sees them at the gates and embraces them both with the same wide, abundant love. John, just the day before he was murdered, had said to the preacher who came as the chaplain to the prison, I do confess my faith in Jesus Christ and in his mercy. John saved, Mary saved. Mary not by anything she did, but because of God's mercy. John saved not because of anything he did, but because of God's mercy. That's hard for us to accept sometimes. The challenge for us when we try to do this is to realize that what that reading from Isaiah says to us, that God's ways are so above our ways, so above our thoughts, because God so profoundly loves. Sisters and brothers, we're privileged to hear this reading today on the 100 and, let me see, what is it, 1800? I even have to look up the date, it's so many years. It's the 109th World Day of Refugees and Migrants. The 109th World Day of Refugees and Migrants that the church celebrates. Now, everybody here who thinks I'm talking about politics, raise your hand. I'm not. I want to be clear. Talking about what the gospel said to us. Because I'm not going to talk to you about public policy. I don't know what we should do in the United States to deal with the challenge of immigration. How many agree that immigration is a challenge in our country? Oh, you're braver than that. Right? It's a challenge. We can agree to that. It's a significant challenge to us. The challenge, though, sisters and brothers, is for us to do what the gospel calls us to see. Not to see people as problems. Not to see families as problems. Not to see children as problems. Not to see anyone born by the love of God as a problem. But to see the problem as the problem. The systems as the problem. Our response as a problem. Pope Francis, on the 108th, think back about this. The Day of Refugees and Migrants began, the first one was in 1914. 1914, sisters and brothers, was the beginning of World War I. The world was faced with a huge refugee problem in the next number of years. My grandfather, Czech by ethnic origin, Ukrainian by the location of where he lived, Russian Empire citizen, fled in 1917 to the United States. He fled, and our family story is we never kept the Czech language. He spoke Russian. We never knew the Russian language because when he came, he was regarded as a potential terrorist. I stand before you, the grandson of an immigrant, a migrant, someone who fled into this nation at a time when he was not welcomed. Sisters and brothers, he was late. He was late to the party. He didn't get here like my other grandfather. My other grandfather was 5 generations in Georgia before he came to Texas. Their family wisened up after all that time and came to Texas. But nonetheless, they're early in the years after the revolution to coming in 1917, just 100 years ago. The gospel, sisters and brothers, calls us to see as God sees. Now we go back to the beginning of the gospel, Matthew's call. How did God see Matthew? Seeing a sinner, he chose him. Seeing a sinner, he chose him. Sisters and brothers, that is what God is calling us today. To see everyone who we encounter, whether they're documented or not, whether they're immigrants or not, but certainly our migrants and refugees on this particular day, to see in them, like ourselves, sinners, but loved and saved by the mercy of God and worthy of the dignity of a child of God. I don't know how we get there, brothers and sisters, I know indeed that is what God is calling us to.
Please like, subscribe, or comment below.